Hey everyone, my name is Eric Manning and you are watching Sunday School Apologetics, and in today's video we are asking, what can we learn about Jesus from the Roman historian Tacitus? Well, for those of you who don't know, Tacitus lived between 56 and 120 AD. He served in the Roman government as a senator and as a consul, and is considered to be one of Rome's greatest historians. He most famously wrote the Annals and Histories. And this is the Oxford Companion to Classical Literature. They have high praise for the Annals. They say that the Annals in particular show Tacitus to have been one of the greatest historians with penetrating insight into character and a sober grasp of the significant issues of the time. What does Tacitus say about Jesus? Quick background information: Nero, not a particularly nice emperor, wanted to gentrify a particular neighborhood in Rome and allegedly set it on fire in order to do so. And then he blamed the Christians for this heinous act. And Tacitus writes, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, referring to the crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, not superstitious, just a little stitious, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of their crime of firing the city as of hatred against all mankind. So Tacitus was no friend to the Christians, and even though he thought Nero was wrong for what he did in pointing this out, he also thought that the Christians were just weird and not particularly good people. Now, here are 7, Roman numeral 7, facts that we can learn from Tacitus's report. Number 1, there was a group of people called Christians. Well, they weren't always called Christians. We do learn in Acts from Luke that around the 40s in Antioch, they were later called Christians. We also learn from Tacitus that their name came from someone called Christus. Well, why is this important? Here's Peter J. Williams in his excellent book, Who Wrote the Gospels, which I will link in the description down below. Williams writes, Latin Christus is simply a transliteration of the Greek word Christos, which means anointed, and is equivalent to the Hebrew word Messiah. As the Messiah was the promised deliverer whom many Jews were expecting, the name Christian tells us clearly of this group's belief that the promised Jewish deliverer had come. So some interesting implications that we already know from the Gospels, but Tacitus confirms as an external source. We also learn, our next fact, is that Christ was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Well, why is that important? Well, again, here is Peter J. Williams. And he says that Tacitus tells us that Christ was put to death while Tiberius was emperor, thus between AD 14 and AD 37. Tacitus also tells us that this happened while Pontius Pilate was in charge of Judea, which was between AD 26 and 36. Tacitus thus gives us an approximate fixed point for the founding events of Christianity. So we have this external Roman source that tells us basically when the birth of Christianity begins, and it's an external confirmation in what we already know from the Gospels. Now, here is the very skeptical New Testament scholar and historian John Dominic Crossan, and he draws some implications here. Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. For if no follower of Jesus had written anything for 100 years after his crucifixion, we'd still know about him from 2 authors not among his supporters. Their names are Flavius Josephus and Cornelius Tacitus. Now, in the description down below, I'm going to link my video that I did previously on Josephus. And again, Crossan mentions Tacitus. Well, why is this important? Well, there are Muslims who say that Jesus never actually was crucified. And there are hyper skeptics that say that no person such as Jesus ever existed. And so here is a very skeptical New Testament scholar who is not a Christian, says that this is as sure of an event as we possibly can know from history. Now, another thing we learn from Tacitus is that the Romans considered Christians to be superstitious. Maybe not, rubbing people's beards for good luck in a baseball game superstitious, but he did think that they were extremely weird. And this is in line with what we know how the Romans saw the Christians. We have this graffiti here, this Roman graffiti that's an archaeological discovery that is dated around the early 3rd century. It says Alexamenus worships his god, and you might not be able to see it, but there is a picture of a guy worshiping somebody who's hanging on a cross with a donkey head. They didn't think much of Jesus. And we also know that the Athenian philosophers were revolted by the very idea of the resurrection when Paul preached to them on Mars Hill. And Paul also says that the preaching of the cross is foolishness for the Greeks and to the Romans. And just the idea of saying a divine man died like a humiliated criminal just doesn't really appeal to the majority of Romans who worshipped their emperors and valued power. Now, we also learn from Tacitus that the Christians were very much hated and were alleged to perform abominations. Well, what are some of those abominations? We actually learn from an early Christian apologist writing around the early 3rd century named Marcus Felix that the Romans thought the Christians were downright weird and spooky. Now, Christians at that time met on Sundays, and they worshiped very early in the morning and met in people's houses. And we know that they practiced communion, and Paul talks about greet one another with a holy kiss. Well, the Romans heard some weird rumors and drew some gross implications, and they said, here's Felix, also a former Roman turned Christian. He says, we were once the same as you, blind and ignorant. Our opinions were once the same as yours. We believe Christians worship monsters, like maybe crucified guys with donkey heads, ate the flesh of infants. Well, I think he's referring to communion there, Jesus saying, eat of my flesh, drink of my blood, and practice incest at their feast. Well, again, greet one another with a holy kiss. Hey, as an introvert and as a slight germaphobe, I am so thankful that we no longer have those practices. He also goes on to say, we did not understand that these tales were being spread abroad by the demons. In other words, Felix is saying that you guys are inspired to spread these tales by some evil spirits without examination or proof. And so this is just a clear indicator of how the Romans saw the Christians, and it's in line with what Tacitus says. Now, Tacitus also says their movement originated in Judea, but spread to Rome, and by 64 there was a vast multitude of Christians in Rome. And so this is very interesting, and again, here's Williams. He says that the rapid spread of Christianity may have relevance for investigating the reliability of the Gospels. Surely the more widespread Christianity became, the harder it would have been for anyone to change its message and beliefs. This would have been particularly so if Christians were paying a high price for their faith. Williams goes on, scholars who argue that the core Christian belief, such as the idea that Jesus rose from the dead after his crucifixion, were later innovations arising as Christianity spread by word of mouth, need to suggest when this might have happened. And so the idea that core beliefs arose decades after Christianity began to spread doesn't explain why Christianity proved popular in the first place, or how people who adhered to a version of Christianity without these beliefs later came to adopt them. And so this really just pokes holes in the legendary development hypothesis. And again, this is in Williams' book, Who Wrote the Gospels? Excellent book. It'll be linked in the description down below. What are some skeptical objections to these passages by Tacitus? Well, some skeptics will say that they were interpolations, and that seems pretty convenient. Here is New Testament scholar Robert Van Voorst in his excellent book, Jesus Outside the New Testament, which again I will link in the description down below. He writes, well-intentioned pagan glossers of ancient text do not normally express themselves in Tacitian Latin. Well, these would be the people that would be transcribing the text. And the same could also be said of Christian interpolators, who would have also possibly been the scribes for these texts. And so he's saying that they're not going to be writing in perfect Tacitian Latin if they're later changing the text down the road. And he also says, finally, no Christian forgers would have made such disparaging remarks that we've already went over about Christianity as we have in the annals. And that just makes a ton of sense. Surely they're not going to say that they're superstitious and known for their abominations and all these terrible things that Tacitus says. Now, here is New Testament scholar and normally a Bible critic, Bart Ehrman, in his book, Did Jesus Exist? And Ehrman isn't having any of this mythicist Kool-Aid. He goes full gangster on it. He says the mythicists certainly have a reason for arguing this. They don't want to think that there are any references to Jesus in our early sources outside of the New Testament. And so when they find such reference, they claim the reference was not original but inserted by the Christians. But surely the best way to deal with evidence is not simply to dismiss it when it happens to be convenient. So, feelings advisory, facts don't care. Bart just isn't having it. We can't just say interpolation every time something is in a text that we don't agree with. And so that's not going to work. Reason number 2, why does Tacitus call Jesus Christ his title rather than Jesus if you really knew something about him? Well, here is New Testament scholar and pastor Greg Boyd in his book, The Jesus Legend, which I will link in the description down below, and is an excellent work that just debunks mythicist claims and is just a good book on the reliability of the Gospels in general. And Boyd says, even if Tacitus did know the name Jesus, he presumably would not have used it in this context, because it would have interfered with his explanation of the origin of Christianoi, or Christians in Christus, confusing his readers. And so why talk about these Christians and then say, hey, the founder was named Jesus? That would be a little bit confusing in reading the text. Number 3, critics will say maybe Tacitus was just being sloppy and getting his sources from third-hand information and not really doing his homework. Well, there's a problem with that, and it's that Tacitus consistently demonstrates a motivation to very critically check his sources. He is known to be one of the most accurate Roman historians there are. And the subject of the passage, Nero, is an official action taken by Nero, who was a Roman emperor, so he's not going to want to play fast and loose with his facts. There are also indicators of several members of the royal family who align themselves with this cult, which would give Tacitus some motivation to discredit this particular cult. The Emperor Vespasian's granddaughter and the Emperor Titus and Domitian's niece Domitilla and her husband Fabius Clemens were accused of atheism, which, if you know anything about the Roman history, they called Christians atheists because they refused to worship any other god but Jesus. And they were also accused, this couple, of being carried away into Jewish customs. And so this could explain why Tacitus speaks of Christianity as a pernicious superstition. This discredited these family members, discredited these Roman emperors, and he didn't particularly like that. Now, number 4, would Tacitus have the means to check out these sources to begin with? Well, some people would say no, he didn't have the means, but that's just silly. Tacitus had access to Acta Senatus, the Senate's archives of its own activities, for he cites these archives twice in his work and makes further use of them, and it's implied that he has very detailed reports of Senate happenings and things that are going on in Rome. There were also other sources that he would have had readily available, including Rome's public libraries, the Acta Diurna, I hope I pronounced that right. It's a daily gazette. It's like their Roman newspaper, biographies, letters, and speeches. And so Tacitus could have very easily checked his archives, and he was motivated to be very accurate. And so these 4 mythicist objections just don't really work. Here is distinguished professor of history Ronald Mellor. He says Tacitus consistently distinguishes fact from rumor with a scrupulosity rare with any ancient historian. The man was just meticulous. And so these mythicist complaints don't really work, and we actually learn a lot about Jesus and Christianity, early Christianity, from Tacitus. And so I hope you found this video helpful. If you do and you want to support me, any support is appreciated. It will help me to purchase new equipment to better improve the qualities of these videos, and a laptop, which I hope you don't hear humming in the background, but it is, and any support is greatly appreciated. And you can also visit my website, isjesusalive.com. Forgive the typo there, but it's isjesusalive.com. And for more historical apologetics and things of that nature. Also, if you found this video, please like, subscribe, and share. And thank you for watching.